Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CSIS. We have a very special event in store for you. I'm Paul Schwartz, and I will be moderating our discussions. Today, we're going to hear from the authors of an important new report, which offers fresh ideas for tackling some of the most challenging and contentious issues in Russian-Western relations, namely those arising from the ongoing competition between Russia and the West over the fate of the former Soviet states in Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus. The Western vision of a new regional order, underpinned by NATO and EU enlargement, has been vigorously contested by Moscow, which has been promoting its own vision of a Russian-led order based on the Collective Security Treaty Organization, its own military alliance, as well as the Eurasian Economic Union. This clash of visions and the relentless competition that it has engendered have sparked serious crises and conflicts in the region over the last 2 decades, most notably in Ukraine and Georgia. These conflicts have also created major economic and security challenges for the countries in the region, including most notably Ukraine, but also Moldova, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, which are the 6 countries which are the subject of this study. These conflicts also lie at the very heart of the current breakdown in relations between Russia and the West. Faced with these pressing geopolitical challenges, there have been remarkably few concrete proposals for how to address the core issues in this dispute. That is why this new report is so important. Titled "A Consensus Proposal for a Revised Regional Order," this proposal was devised by 3 groups of experts convened by the RAND Corporation and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe. The report offers a comprehensive approach for addressing the core economic and security challenges facing post-Soviet Eurasia and Europe. It contains detailed proposals on 3 areas: proposals for revising the regional security architecture, for promoting greater economic integration, and resolving various regional conflicts. We are pleased to have with us today 4 of the leading authors and contributors of this report who are prepared to discuss the key aspects of their proposal. First, I am pleased to introduce to my right Dr. Samuel Cherep. He is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation and an expert on the political economy and foreign and security policies of Russia and the former Soviet states. Also with us today is Dr. Alexandra Dinas. She's a research associate at the Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. She specializes in the foreign and political economy of Russia and the post-Soviet space. We're also fortunate to have with us today Vasyl Filipchuk, who is a senior advisor at the International Center for Policy Studies in Ukraine. He is an expert on Ukrainian foreign policy and European integration and has held many high-level positions in the Ukrainian government. Joining us as well is Dr. Yulia Nikitina, who is an associate professor and a research fellow at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, where she specializes in the politics of security in Eurasia with a focus on regional organizations. Rounding out our panel is Dr. Jeffrey Mankoff, who is the Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program here at CSIS and an expert on the foreign and security policy of Russia and the former Soviet states. Jeff, who did not participate directly in the project, is going to provide additional commentary on the report. As always, we wish to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, whose generous support has made this event possible. As I understand it, each of the co-authors is going to deliver a short series of presentations, after which Jeff will provide commentary, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sam.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you to all of you for coming. Paul actually did a lot of my work for me, so I'm going to be very brief. I'll just mention a couple of things in introduction before handing it over to my colleagues who will get into the substance. This was not your run-of-the-mill think tank project. Our intent was not to devise immediately applicable policy recommendations to governments that they could pick up and try to implement today. Instead, we were trying to anticipate what the outcome of a negotiation could be if it were to begin. So it's a bit of an abstraction. And within each of our three groups, we all had to make compromises to find common ground. We also operated within each of our three groups, the one on the security architecture, economic integration, and regional conflicts, on the assumption that the other two processes were operating in parallel. So we assumed that because the nature of the dispute has become, these issues have become so interlinked that the solution to them would have to also be interlinked. So we're talking about three parallel processes because, for example, it's hard to imagine an agreement on the security architecture if there isn't a significant progress, if not resolution, on regional conflicts, and perhaps vice versa. So the three chapters are therefore interrelated because we made assumptions about what was going on in the other tracks. But the individual groups operated independently and really only saw the other products of those other groups when the drafts were finished. The authors, therefore, only bear direct responsibility for the working group in which they participated. But we all had the opportunity to review the text, and all of the three groups, plus our sort of steering committee, agreed to have their names associated with it. By consensus, we do not mean that everyone necessarily agrees with everything in the report. In fact, you know, I could name a number of things that I disagree with. But it meant that we all thought that these ideas were an important starting point to a conversation that we'd like to begin with this project. And I think that's probably overall, the details I think are very important, but the bigger picture, that might be the most valuable contribution. I don't think any of us think it's ideal, but we all agreed that it's an important opening contribution to the debate and something that we had not been able to see in other contexts. So I'll mention a few caveats before turning it over to Yulia. So this is not, again, a proposal that is likely, and we recognize this, to be implemented in the current political environment. It is more of a thought experiment, a description of what might be possible, intended to foster discussion. And it's just one vision of a way forward. We're eager to hear your views on what might be another vision of the way forward. But we start with the premise that the status quo is not working for any of the major actors involved, and an alternative that could produce more security and prosperity in the region would be preferable. So Yulia, who was a member of the steering committee, has agreed to present the work of the security architecture group. And then Alexandra, who is the co-chair of the economic integration group, will talk about their proposals. Finally, Vasil, who, along with me, was involved in the regional conflicts group, will present the ideas that we came up with. So with that, I'll hand it over to Yulia.
Thank you, Sam. Well, yeah, that was a disclaimer, and indeed that's more a compromise proposal, the least common denominator, and not so much a consensus proposal. And what's more, well, these days everyone is afraid of spoilers, so now I will give you a spoiler that, you know, official Russia probably wouldn't support this proposal, so now you will be listening even more attentively to our parts to be ready to provide counter-arguments probably. Well, hopefully we really want to have some criticism in order to develop our argumentation. So generally our basic assumption is that now the situation in Eurasia is in a deadlock, and we need to find a way out. And I will very briefly present the findings of the group. Unfortunately, I didn't participate in the debates, but I will present it as I was a member of the steering committee. And generally, we assume that now there is a lack of communication between the major parties, and there is a need to create a mechanism for communication. And we have four suggestions how to create such a mechanism. So we call it regional security consultation. So it all starts with level 1, regional security consultations. That is something between, let's say, group of 7, group of 20 informal clubs, and ad hoc meetings. So it's not an institution, it's not something like ad hoc meetings, that's a series of regional security consultations. Who would be members of those? The United States, Russia, the European Union, and the so-called in-between states, states of common neighborhood between Russia and the European Union, and any OSCE state, actually, if it believes that it has to discuss something with the US, Russia, and the European Union. So that's level 1, architecture. Level 2, norms. We believe that it is important to introduce norms of behavior for the participating parties. And for the major powers, they have to commit to try to achieve consensus before implementing any changes to the security architecture. We understand that most probably it will be very difficult to reach such a consensus, but major powers have to commit that they will try to. They will at least meet and try to achieve consensus. And they commit not to threaten the existing security architecture, including both NATO and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, for example. And the second dimension of norms is that countries in between can adopt the so-called third way, non-aligned status. And that's their choice. They may adopt it or not, that's up to them. But if they do adopt it, it means that they will get security guarantees from the major powers, that they will not try to compromise their non-aligned status. Then, in order to support this, we introduced the concept of mutual security guarantees, supported by confidence and security building measures. So, as to the, excuse me, okay. Mutual security guarantees means that major states have to politically commit themselves to abide by these agreements. We understand that it's very difficult to make these agreements legally binding. That's the major problem of international relations in general, legally binding agreements and enforcement. But it is in the interest of all the parties to commit themselves, simply because the alternative is a deadlock that we have now. So that's why we believe that it's still feasible. But we expect some criticism on this point. And we think that the confidence and security building measures would be important, such as for guaranteeing powers, no stationing of forces on the territory of the in-between states that adopt the third way non-alignment, or no covert intelligence gathering or other hostile activities against signatories of the arrangement on the territory of in-between states, or something like ban on exercises in the zone of between the alliances. So we have a very detailed list of measures, and we believe that this complex might work. So architecture, norms, mutual security guarantees, plus confidence and security building measures. But of course, it won't be possible without the economic cooperation and the specific security measures that will be discussed by Vasil. Thank you.
Distinguished audience, let's cover the economy, the group that I had the pleasure to co-chair and participate. Well, as Sam was already mentioning, and as Julia mentioned, citing the least common denominator, our group was very contentious as well. So you need to imagine really tough negotiations. We had one member who used to be the EU negotiator for the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine, which did not come to happen, as you know. The Russian counterpart had a totally different opinion from the EU counterpart. We have a Moldovan in our group and Armenian. So very contentious discussions on what seems to be a fairly technical aspect of a regional order, namely the economy. But in fact, it's being politicized, and it's a very difficult and important piece of the puzzle as well. Why does the economy matter? Well, first of all, we have witnessed in the case of Ukraine, but also other so-called in-between countries, that economic relations can very easily become a source of friction. And the purpose of this proposal for an alternative regional economic integration is that those relations, economic relations, cease to become source of friction, and to the contrary, that they become the source of prosperity, because this is ultimately what this proposal for regional order is about. It's about security and about higher prosperity for the member countries. So what do I mean, or what do we mean by frictions in the region from the economic perspective? You may be well aware that membership in different customs unions is not possible. So one country cannot be a member of two different custom unions. And we have two of them in the region. We have the EU, obviously, and we have the Eurasian Economic Union, which is an integration organization around Russia and other 4 member states, which is Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. Well, two members, two in-between countries, namely Armenia and Belarus, are members of the Eurasian Economic Union and thus cannot bilaterally negotiate their own trade arrangements. So this kind of places limitations on the countries. The same goes, by the way, vice versa. Those countries who signed deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, which is Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, they cannot become members of the Eurasian Economic Union, or it's hard for them to have deeper economic ties with Russia and other members of the Eurasian Economic Union. So there's friction, there's lost economic opportunity, and there are kind of opportunities that are foregone. We have looked at trade statistics, and trade statistics shows very clearly for the in-between region that they depend on trade both with Russia and the European Union. And I think this is a very important underlying kind of basic fact that we need to keep in mind, that those countries need trade with both East and West for their full development and prosperity. So our proposal, we know about the status quo, we know that it's suboptimal. What's the proposal? It consists of 3 parts. First is enhancement of multi-directional trade relations, which means trade relations with both East and West, so the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union, easement of tensions in trade. Second, trilateral consultations. By trilateral, we mean, again, the EU, the Eurasian Economic Union, and the in-between countries. And finally, norms governing behavior between the blocs. And I will elaborate a little bit on each of those points. Obviously, the core of the proposal is the multi-directional trade relations. And here we had some proposals targeting both this macro level, so to speak, of cooperation between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union, and some more targeted measures for each of the in-between countries. So on this macro level, obviously we need some kind of dialogue and cooperation between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union, which is currently de facto not the case. The reasons are political. It's all the difficulties in Russia-West relations in the wake of the conflict in and around Ukraine. You know all that. What would be helpful? Helpful would be a permanent task force dealing with harmonization of technical standards and trade procedures, transit, trade transit. Such permanent task force would lead to approximation between those different standards. It would ease trade and ultimately reduce the transaction costs for countries in between. There are multiple studies showing that there would be sufficient and substantial benefits for trade if such an agreement or cooperation between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union came about. In the very long term, it can be an FTA, a free trade zone, but this is certainly a very long-term objective if there were a political decision on both sides to do so, and it would require Belarus membership in the WTO. In the meantime, some less ambitious framework agreement would be thinkable. For example, a mutual declaration that the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union are not in conflict, acknowledge each other's existence, and want to enhance trade between each other. As for the individual measures, I won't go too much into detail, just to draw your attention to a few interesting cases. Georgia doesn't have diplomatic relations with Russia, as you know, but has been pursuing gradual normalization of trade with Russia since 2012. and is now even a member of Commonwealth of Independent States Free Trade Zone, which is very important not only for Georgia's economy, who also depends substantially on export of some of its products to Russia, for example, wines or mineral water or fruit, traditionally very popular in Russia, but also it's important for Armenia, because Armenia is the member of the Eurasian Economic Union and would have been isolated without the opportunity to channel its goods through Georgia. So Georgia's membership in CIS Free Trade Zone is very important for Armenia, who depends on this transit. Maybe a word on Armenia as well. Armenia has signed SEPA, Comprehensive and Enhanced Partnership Agreement with the EU. As you may be aware, instead of its association agreement with the EU, which did not work out, let me put it this way, for political reasons, Armenia did the U-turn and joined the Eurasian Economic Union instead. But in our group, there were discussions considering this a very good example of some flexibility and pointing to the direction of possibility of multi-directional trade relations, having deep relations with Russia and the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, and at the same time having some enhanced, deeper ties with the EU. So this points to the right direction, as we thought. Trilateral consultations, the second part of the proposal. Just briefly, trilateral means EU, the Eurasian Economic Union, the respective country in between. In such trilateral format, disputes could be resolved, for example, around phytosanitary standards or some other trade disputes, but also larger issues such as, for example, change of trade arrangements in the future. If somebody wants to enter or exit a bloc or somehow change trade arrangements, this country could address the trilateral consultation. It's not a must, it's a possibility, again, voluntarily. We believe that this would ease tensions, and we have examples from the past where this worked well. For example, when the EU back in 2004 was enlarging towards the east, there were consultations with Russia and many contentious issues, which were mostly technical in nature, for example, transit to Kaliningrad or tariffs for aluminium and other stuff. They were addressed through such consultations. So this would be advisable to do that again in the future. Finally, the last component of the proposal in the economic realm, norms governing the behavior. Well, the first norm would be to mutually accept the legitimacy of the composition of the trading blocs, so kind of to acknowledge that the Eurasian Economic Union is there, that the EU is there, and to pledge, so to speak, not to poach members, so to respect the choice of the in-between countries where they want to be members, and not to push them to exit or enter a new alliance. So taken together, those three components, the multi-directional trade relations, trilateral consultations if disputes arise or economic arrangements want to be changed in the future, and norms governing the behavior between the blocs, we believe that this is a good foundation to address the economic woes of the region and also to enhance the prosperity and lay the foundation for both addressing the security architecture intricacies and, of course, the resolution of regional conflicts. And I hand over to Vasil.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Yulia. As Sam said, we had three different groups of experts from different countries, each group with its own composition, atmosphere, relationship, and you can imagine what was in a group which was assigned to talk about regional conflicts, where you have on one side a Russian representative and on the other side Ukrainian, Georgian, and Moldovan. So emotions were not just high. Sometimes we just thought we cannot agree about anything. But at the end, we all made some efforts. Of course, our Russian counterpart killed plenty of my nice ideas. I couldn't but every time raise an issue that they must return Crimea and get out with their armament. They strongly disagreed, and at the end, we came to the lowest common denominator, which was that we must, first of all, to talk about conflict management, as long as we don't see a settlement on the reach. And only on the basis of efficient conflict settlement, we can talk about conflict management, we can talk about conflict settlement. So what we agreed were basically three points. Point one, people first, rephrasing your president. We should care in our efforts in conflict management about people who are living there. People who are not responsible for mistakes of politicians, people who are not responsible for diplomats incapable to propose something which would settle the conflict. So we should care about pensioners, kids who happen to be victims of these conflicts. And for that, we proposed a list of enhanced multilateral status neutral conflict measures to reduce pain. Pain reduction was our agreement number one. Point two, more trust through risk reduction measures, mainly in the military area. Understanding communication which would avoid any worsening of situation, renewal of military actions, and so on. And third point on which we all agreed is more international engagement. We need to see renewed international commitment to make additional incentives for conflict settlement, effective conflict management, and efforts into reconstruction of consequences of regional conflicts. So on each of these 3 points, we presented a table. Some of you who could see the book could look at these tables and list of proposals. I think for practitioners in foreign affairs, for diplomats, when they have a visit coming or their bosses are screaming, give us some ideas what to do, it would be a very helpful instrument where they could see a long list of different measures. It's not country-specific measures. Some of these measures we just have taken from experience of other conflict settlement. It was very interesting to analyze specific Moldovan experience. Settlement of Transnistrian conflict in Moldova provided us a very interesting examples how conflicts, while being not settled, become really convenient, if I may say so. No one cares about Transnistrian conflict if you talk about citizens of this country. Only 1% of Moldovans consider that Transnistrian conflict is priority for them. They just don't see any threat from this conflict. They can travel contact line for Sunday market to buy potatoes in other side. No one cares if car plates with registration from another side are on their own territory. So this conflict is convenient. Of course, it's very far from ideal. I would wish conflict is settled and Transnistria is an integral part of Moldova, but realities are that it's not. So we studied good examples of conflict management in Moldova, in Georgia, by the way, also very interesting example of conflict settlement. While looking at this example, sometimes me as Ukrainian, a country which is a victim of Russian invasion in 2014, annexation of Crimea, and conflict in Donbass, where we have 13,000 people died because of actions of pro-Russian separatists. Of course, it's unthinkable to imagine some of actions which were implemented in Moldova. For example, integration of road and rail networks, or a simple thing, recognition of car plates. In Ukraine, to imagine a car with car plate Donetsk People's Republic is unthinkable. This car would not move even 200 meters. In Moldova, they are okay with this. Even more, Moldovan representatives, they share their own experience of positive discrimination when companies from this separatist entity have better treatment than their own companies, in order to ensure that they feel they belong to the same country and so on. So in our case, whenever we see shelling, even now, it's still unthinkable, but in case if we have to accept the fact that we cannot settle the problem in the nearest future, what to do with this? Ideally, of course, tomorrow Minsk agreement should be implemented and Donbass should be back to Ukraine. But if not, what should we do? So we have a long list of pain reduction measures. We also divided them in different groups, economic, humanitarian, people-to-people. Some of them are very distant. Some of them must be done today. Some of them are done. For example, if we talk about payment of pensions and facilitating of access to pension system, it's not fair for people who worked all their life and paid their pension contributions and then happen to be in a territory controlled by separatists or in Crimea controlled by Russia. They are not responsible for that. They may have their pensions. So we proposed a number of actions in this direction. The same about people-to-people contacts. For example, again, experience of Moldova when sportsmen from Transnistrian separatist enclave participate in international competitions under Moldova flag and participate in Eurovision song contest under Moldova name. So it's all is just very interesting and positive examples of how to make life not miserable, not bad, even if you still have a conflict on the table. So another priority, less risks. How to do it? Mainly and first of all through more efforts in military-to-military contacts. And you have a long list of measures which we see in communication area, in area of transparency and restraint of military forces. We talk about appointment of contacts between military offices, military-to-military hotlines, consultations on unusual military activities, warning messages about preparation of certain military activities, withdrawal of certain heavy military equipment, and so on. Especially important issue for my country, and we all agreed with this, is divining. We have very often, sometimes every week, a report about someone being killed of mine in the area. In eastern Ukraine, I think we have one of the biggest, if not the biggest, area full of mines in Europe, or maybe even beyond Europe. So here, whatever is situation with conflict settlement, something must be done to reduce risks and to make this area less less threatening for human being lives. On the third part, on a stronger international engagement, of course, I see here Ambassador Taylor. 1 year ago, we had a very interesting event here in Washington on a possibility of international peacekeeping operations, and we promoted an idea of international interim administration for Donbass. As for me, it would be the best way to bring peace as soon as possible to Donbass and to facilitate implementation of Minsk agreements. It was not accepted. However, we all agreed that international peacekeeping presence is strongly recommended under certain conditions. For example, you all know what is Minsk agreements, and Minsk agreements should lead to elections. And we have OSCE. OSCE is monitoring situation on the ground, and OSCE, according to European standards, must verify whether elections are free and fair. So who should organize these elections for OSCE monitoring mission to assess was it free and fair or not? Obviously, it can be done neither by unrecognized entities. It cannot be done by Russians. It cannot physically done by Ukrainians. So it should be only international entity, like, for example, well-known instrument, which is UN electoral mission, which could be neutral, which could come prepare a voting process which could be impartial, ensure equal access, all the standards, and after this OSCE would make a judgment whether elections were free and fair. So such kind of ideas were agreed and welcomed, and we think there is a good potential for international presence to be there. But not only in this. During our discussion, we spent a lot of time thinking what should be incentives. How you, even if there is no settlement on the geopolitical level, it would be very good if it is, but even if there is not, what are incentives from the international community for parties to cooperate? And of course, we came here with a number of proposals, for example, reconstruction assistance. We think that parties, international community can propose to war-torn regions concepts, ideas, like, for example, we studied experience of Balkans, where EU established an agency which successfully contributed to reconstruction, and the same can be done in Ukraine. Of course, there's a number of preconditions. Number one is there should be no shelling anymore, there should be a sustainable ceasefire. But in case if it is achieved, it can be also an incentive to achieve the ceasefire if this proposal is on the table. So there should be more economic carrots as well as sticks for entities, and clear understanding that in case if we have progress in conflict management, everyone could win, those who are now in not controlled territories, those who are on the other side, and the national community in general. But it's just some elements from what we discussed. I'm ready to discuss them and answer your questions as well. Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind. So that we just threw a lot of information at you. I should note that I have a bunch of copies of the physical book here for those of you who can wait until the end, then I'm happy to distribute. It's also freely available online. If I had to give you the 1 minute overview of what you just heard, there's 4 pieces of the security architecture proposal. It was regional security consultations, agreement on norms of behavior, the third way status option, and associated multilateral security guarantees and competence and security building measures. On the economic integration piece, we heard about multi-directional trade relations measures, trilateral consultations, and norms of behavior. And finally, Vasil mentioned our agreement on enhanced conflict management measures, a recommitment to conflict settlement, and incentives to the parties to engage. So these are all, the contention is a potentially viable alternative to the status quo that would be beneficial for all parties involved. That would provide a degree of stability to the broader Russia-West competition. It's not going to make that competition go away, but it could stabilize it and would provide significant security and prosperity benefits to the states caught in between. Now, I will just hopefully, so that we can get into the details and some discussion of the specifics and hear maybe any of your ideas about alternatives to the status quo, talk a little bit about some of the objections we've heard in previous presentations of this report, so maybe we can get those out of the way and talk about something else. One thing we hear often is an objection to the term in between states, and that it denies these countries agencies. I should say we had a lot of debate about that term in our groups, and the term derives from the idea of being caught in between. In other words, that these states are not necessarily party to the Russia-West competition, but they are suffering as a result of it. And the idea of the project is, in fact, to return them agency, not to deny them. Another objection we often hear is that before doing anything, you must assign blame for past wrongs and decide who is guilty for the status quo that we have today. Usually someone has a particular guilty party in mind when they make that comment. Varies, of course, depending on where you are. But the premise that we started from was, in fact, that you don't need to agree on who was guilty for past sins in order to come to agreement about improving the status quo and providing additional stability and security. There are countless examples from the Cold War when irreconcilable rivals were able to find agreements that provided stability without agreeing about why the problem itself initially was created. In terms of the work on the regional conflicts, we're often told, well, every conflict is unique. How could you possibly propose universal solutions? Well, our approach was to offer a menu of options that could or could not be used depending on the appropriate circumstances for the individual conflict. So we, of course, acknowledge that every conflict is, in fact, unique. But that having a menu of available options, as Vasil mentioned, would be beneficial. We also often get the accusation that this is some sort of new Yalta agreement with big states imposing their will on smaller ones. I think you've probably heard the word optional or option or offer a number of times from my colleagues. That was intentional. There's nothing here that would entail any state having any choices denied to it. It's in fact offering them new ones. And finally, one objection we often hear is about, it's a general one, which is why should we, our side, depending on which side you're on, it differs, make any concessions? The other side will just pocket those concessions and take advantage of our willingness to do so. And, there's a lot of reasons for this belief, of course. Recent history has created a lot of reasons for that kind of mistrust. But I think the idea here is that we have a means of testing the proposition that under different circumstances, the behavior of the parties involved could be different. And so if you truly believe that we're dealing with, depending on which side you're on, the other side being an intent on regional domination at all costs, then we should pretty much all go home and forget about trying to improve the situation, because it would be impossible. If you at least think that there's a potential that we could be in a situation where under different circumstances parties' behavior could be different, this is one potential means of testing that proposition. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff, and I look forward to his remarks.
Okay, thanks, Sam, and thanks to all of our presenters. First of all, let me give you guys credit for taking on what I'm sure is a politically unpopular task, one that I imagine you've gotten lots of negative feedback on in a number of different places. I'm not going to pile on. I have criticisms, but I'm going to try and engage the project on its own terms. I think it's really important that you characterize this as a thought experiment, or since working with German partners, Gedankenexperiment. Because I think one of the big challenges that a vision like this is going to have is how do you go from the conceptual to the implementation, right? I think if we were having this conversation in 1990 or 1991, at the end of the Cold War, where the entire nature of the European and transatlantic security architecture was undetermined, it was in flux. It would have been, and in fact there were these kind of conversations about, can you create some entirely new framework for managing these relationships? And of course the answer was not really, for a variety of reasons. But that was a particularly fluid moment, and the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, was responsible for creating that fluidity. I think one of the challenges we face now is that that kind of fluidity doesn't exist. Obviously, the status quo is suboptimal in a lot of ways for most of, certainly as you characterize them, in-between countries, but in a lot of ways for countries on either side of the in-between as well. But for most of them, the costs of the status quo are largely bearable. And as you said, there's a tendency to want to assign blame elsewhere, to think that there's no need to compromise, to think that in some way the status quo can go on, and that at the very least the alternatives are worse, that in some way they require giving up on some kind of dearly held principle. And I'm not sure that the perception of risk is sufficient, maybe it is in some of the in-between countries, to convince political elites on a large scale to abandon the positions that they've held on the nature of this architecture for a long time. There's another issue here, too, that I think differentiates where we are today from, say, at the end of the Cold War, and if we were having this conversation 30 years ago. And that is, there is a sense in which the clash, the confrontation between, let's say, Russia and the West, isn't only a geopolitical clash. It's not only about territory or institutions, but increasingly, and I think you hear this in the discussion in Washington increasingly, it's characterized as a conflict of ideology or of governance models. And obviously we had agreements during the Cold War between ideologically opposed blocs, states, but that ideology made the process more difficult. Now, I'm not sure that I entirely embrace the idea of there being an ideological conflict today. I think certainly it's less pronounced than it was during the Cold War, but I think there is a element within which it's hard to envision how you get some kind of agreed upon framework for reconstructing the regional architecture that is basically neutral on some of these ideological questions, that doesn't address questions of governance. Because I think what people in a lot of these countries perceive is not only that they are being pulled in different directions, they're being pulled east and west in terms of, did they sign an agreement with the European Union or with the Eurasian Economic Union, but also that they're being presented and in some ways coerced into adopting incompatible governance models, whatever you want to sort of characterize them as. And so how do you address this problem of maintaining the political sovereignty, the internal sovereignty of these countries? How do you provide reassurance against what I think a lot of their elites and populations see as attempts to undermine their political system? Is this approach basically neutral on the question of is democracy or democratization a good thing, or are we agnostic about that question? Another issue I would sort of push you to consider is, in a similar vein, is what happens if political change occurs in one or more of these countries? It certainly requires political buy-in from governments and elites more broadly to participate in this menu of proposals that you laid out. Somebody mentioned legally binding guarantees and the difficulties that those present. I mean, one of the difficulties they present is that governments and their priorities change. So what happens if you have a government headed by a person, let's call him Viktor Yanukovych, who signs up to one of these proposals, and then a couple of years later is turfed out of office for one reason or another, and the new government comes in and is headed by somebody who has a completely different view of where his or her country fits within this regional architecture. How does this structure manage and maintain the sovereignty of these countries in between if they decide at some point that they want to change their mind? And so, in that sense, I take your point that we're not recreating the Yalta Agreement here, but I do think that, one of the characteristics of the Yalta system was that it kind of attempted to freeze in amber or freeze in time a settlement that was relevant as it existed in the 1940s, but over time, pressures built up against that system. People revolted against the idea that they were being deprived of the ability to make other choices. And that emergence of other ideas, the pressure for something different, was one of the things that contributed to the breakdown of that system. And then just a couple of more small things that, it might be worth thinking about, or I'd be curious to hear your response to. I think it was Vasil who talked about trust and the importance of trust, and I think that certainly is true. Can you do this without trust? Is trust a precondition, or is trust something that you only get to once you've been able to go through this kind of iterative process of developing new arrangements and new institutions? And can you develop those new institutions and arrangements in the absence of trust? And then finally, where does the U.S. fit into all of this? We're having this conversation in Washington, of course, and I think people here would be interested in hearing about, how the U.S. does or doesn't fit into these visions. This is very much a European, Eurasian order more than it is a transatlantic order. But obviously, the United States is going to have interests and ideas about what happens in a part of the world, particularly given its involvement in NATO. And so, where does the U.S. fit? What role does the U.S. have in this process? What kind of voice does the U.S. have, and how does this all affect U.S. interests? Let me stop there, but again, thank you guys for taking on what is a really ambitious and probably in a lot of ways thankless task, and for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Let me also second that sentiment, because I do think this was a bold and ambitious program to go well beyond some of the previous proposals that we've heard. Nothing recently, of course, since the breakdown in relations between Russia and the West, but in the past, you heard things like Russia should join NATO, or there should be a universal free trade agreement across the entire space. So I want to thank you first for that very terrific and informative briefing. Once again, I was struck by how much detail was provided in this proposal, how much thought has gone into both the substance as well as the mechanisms and processes by which it would be agreed upon and implemented. For someone who's negotiated a lot of agreements, it's fascinating to see how this project, which in many ways resembled a negotiation, was able to reach consensus on so many different issues and come up with creative solutions to difficult problems. One thing I think would be worth, before we open up to question and answer, Q&A from the audience, I want to ask a couple of questions. One thing I think would be helpful to clarify is the main mechanisms by which competition between the West and Russia would be constrained in both the security space as well as the economic space. You touched on all of the points, but maybe to provide a little more clarity to this, the relationship between the norms, the non-poaching agreement, the consultation, before a country, one of the in-between states, could change its current orientation to either go neutral, maybe withdraw from an existing arrangement, or maybe to switch, and maybe an in-between country that's not as aligned could then switch to being either aligned with NATO and the EU or with Russia. This comes up in both the economic as well as the security field, so maybe spend a little more time on clarifying how that actually works as a unified solution would be helpful. Thank you. I'm not sure who wants to take that. Maybe Yulia?
I start with a couple of things and then pass it on to others.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you guys both for really interesting questions and comments. Jeff makes a very good point at the start about the nature of rigidity and fluidity in the regional order compared to particularly the 1989-1991 period. If I would say something, which is that the premise of all three groups was that we need to start where we are. So we did not try to do pie in the sky, but instead assume that the institutions and institutional memberships as they are today will endure. And that, in fact, that should be respected. The question is what to do about potential future institutional change. And so one of the strengths, I think, of a number of the pieces of the proposal is that it does not assume dramatic change. I mean, even on the economic side, we assume that the countries that have signed a DCFTA will remain parties to the DCFTA, and the question is about tinkering around the edges, essentially, to facilitate multi-directional trade. Where do we stand on democracy? Or so how does reform fit into all of this, I think is another way of putting this, Jeff's second point. It's a very good question for reasons that probably are a function of the nature of the format of the project. In other words, that everyone had to a certain extent agree on most things. That wasn't going to be front and center. But I would say that nothing in the paper prevents, attempts to facilitate reform in the region. And nowhere does it say that because a state adopts non-aligned status, therefore you cannot help it reform and institutionalize its democracy. Quite the opposite, of course, and we have a number of examples in Europe of non-aligned states that are well-functioning institutionalized democracies. The political change question. So this is a really key point because the idea of several pieces of the proposal was to, in fact, be flexible enough to deal with political change in the future. Precisely for the example, thinking about the example that Jeff mentioned about 2014, Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, and what happens then. So what would be different, at least according to the security architecture, proposal is that there would be a crisis communication mechanism in place to deal with precisely this set of issues. And so I think that would at least give us a better chance of heading off the kinds of miscommunication and miscalculation that resulted in that year. But more broadly, change is not ruled out, but in fact explicitly accepted as possible and, a potential natural outcome of political developments in the countries of the region. So if a country wants to change its future arrangements, it is welcome to do so. These are about providing additional options for them. I think if trust were a precondition to doing anything on this, we would never advance, because we start from the premise that there is zero trust, and that and also that you don't really need to trust your a partner in an international negotiation in order to achieve stability. The U.S. and the Soviet Union did not trust each other. They were able to find agreements that benefited both sides and arguably the world. I'm thinking of arms control, or even the Austria. Fair enough, but not every treaty that was signed between the U.S. and Soviet Union had intrusive verification. We could talk about, in the paper, the Austria State Treaty is mentioned as one example of that. But I'll let my colleagues follow up.
Okay. Well, there were a lot of points that I would like to comment on, but probably there will be more questions from the audience, so now I will react only to some aspects. So on Yalta, we know that, well, okay, grand bargain, but on the other end of the spectrum, we have suggestions like common security space from Vancouver to Vladivostok, which is idealistic. So the current proposal that we are discussing is somewhere in the middle between the very geopolitical approaches of division of spheres of influence and very idealistic approach that everyone should be friends. So that's pretty much realistic. And indeed, trust is not a precondition. We hope that it will be the result of all those communications within the security architecture and economic architecture. Well, as to the process of change, indeed, so let's take the example of the revolution in Armenia in 2018. Nikol Pashinyan, before becoming the leader of Armenia, had very explicit comments that Armenia needs to become the member, probably, well, of the European Union, or even well, member of NATO. So he was very pro-Western, I would say. And like a thought exercise, because that's all about imagining things. So if he maintained this position after he really became elected, then it would have created a crisis. And such a mechanism would say that, okay, Armenia, you have this third way. If you want to leave the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union, as you, the leader of Armenia, suggest, then a third way would be an option. You would receive guarantees both from Russia and the European Union and the United States that your non-alignment status will not be compromised, because if Armenia leaves all the Russia alliances with Russia, both security and economic, and then switches its foreign policy, then you would imagine that this would create a lot of debates about this situation. So this didn't happen. That's a thought exercise. But we understand that there are a lot of situations like that, and we need to be ready how to discuss these issues. And I reassure you that, well, from the official perspective, Russia wouldn't be probably happy with such a security architecture, because here in the US we very often get an comment that, okay, we would give up everything to Russia. Russia would have a right to have a veto on the decisions made by the in-between countries, and Russia would say that, okay, why the US would have a veto on the decisions of the countries in Eurasia? Because there was a question like, where does the US fit in this? The Russian response would be nowhere. Like, why should we have the US in Eurasia? So you see that there are really a lot of things that we disagree on, I mean, officially, the governments. But if we want to find an alternative, we have to put aside all those official positions for a moment and try to really find an alternative future and see whether it is feasible or not. So that was the point of the exercise.
Anybody else want to add anything to that?
Maybe answer on 2 points. First, about what you asked about what is first, trust or progress in settlement. I think it's a chicken-egg dilemma. What's the first? I think it's both in the same time. And by the way, we have a very good example how trust can be generated. Those of you who follow Ukraine on, at least on regular basis, know that last year we had level of trust between Ukraine and Russia below 0. There was no contacts, no trust, basically nothing. And President Zelensky, who was, but you all know who is President Zelensky, who was elected in April last year, basically had a first task how to start contacts with Russians based on zero-level trust. And there were different proposals. I personally considered he must develop a big peace plan and have it for Ukraine's internal discussion, because peace with Russia is not international issue. It's first of all Ukraine's internal political issue. But he was silent about any strategic vision what to do with Russia. And he decided to do something very different, to make very small steps. First, there was exchange of prisoners. Exchange which was done on very tough conditions, which very few believed our president would do it, but he did. Then Ukrainian boats were returned. Then gas deal, which very few believed would ever be concluded, was concluded on compromise basis. So with small steps, we just see now how trust a little bit is getting there and generated, and trust is basically building blocks of any type of conflict settlement. We are now quite confident that there is a permanent channel of communication between Ukrainian and Russian presidents. There are two people who are fully authorized, and we don't know what they discuss. It's another problem, but what is important that this channel it functions, and we at least could expect that certain trust might be built on, and it gives certain hope that next Normandy 4 meeting would lead to more significant results, and we could see progress in Minsk implementation. At least we see even publicly announced hopes that next October we'll have elections in not controlled territories of Ukraine. So by these small steps, trust was established, and we see now how every next step helps to strengthen this trust, not undermines. And here I would come to another even more interesting issue, where is US? And I must tell, I feel furious discussing about US policy on Ukraine, and especially when I hear statements like there is a fight between Russia and US over Ukraine. It's not. It does not exist. I don't see how US is fighting for Ukraine. I see how Russia is fighting for Ukraine, it's true. But we have in US number 10, maybe 20 well-educated, trained professionals, diplomats who know what is Ukraine and who care about what is Ukraine. But overall, if you want to know what is Ukraine in US priorities, it's very advisable to read article in The Atlantic called Obama Doctrine. Your previous president gave a very explicit quotation what he thinks about Ukraine in U.S. foreign policy, where he said that even if Russia twice attacked Ukraine, U.S. would not send its troops to defend Ukraine, which is actually really the frank description of what is U.S. role in Ukraine. I think it's very not sufficient, and I think it must be not doubled, but 4 times more than it is now. Because if you look at the structure of the conflict in Ukraine, conflict around Ukraine, conflict between Ukraine and Russia is multi-layer. It, of course, has internal roots, it has Ukrainian-Russian direction, but main direction is geopolitical. It's why this research was helpful, because it's really perceived from Russian side as fight between Russia and the West, Russia and US for Ukraine. But what is lacking here is that US is not fighting with Russia for Ukraine. Yes, US is supporting Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO, but let's be also frank, as long as there is conflict with Russia, Ukraine will not be able to join NATO because of strong opposition to this issue from number of NATO member states, European member states. So where US could really play its role is to unlock this problem of security by providing Ukraine direct or multilateral security guarantees, which would remove our fears of Russian aggressiveness and which would remove an issue of NATO. But for that, there should be a strong political will in Washington, which unfortunately I don't see now. So stronger US engagement, it's one of must elements in settlement of conflicts in Ukraine and in the region. Without strong US leadership, credible US leadership, it will be very difficult to imagine any significant progress in conflict settlement. Sorry to be rude.
Thank you, Vasil, and to everybody else who contributed. So we're going to open this up for Q&A from the audience. Please raise your hand, wait for the mic. When you're called, please state your name and your affiliation, and we'd appreciate if you keep your comments brief and formulating as a question. So let's start with young lady up front and the gentleman here to the left.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your panel. My name is Emilia. I'm a student from Ukraine studying at American University. I find your report very complex and very controversial at the same time. And I'd like to point out a few concerns of mine and then build a question around them. So on page 13 in your document, you are stating that Western leading countries continue to seek NATO and EU membership, even though having a few prospects of ever obtaining it because they're struggling to ensure their own security. And in connection with the following, you propose to establish a system which seeks to establish a process in which future changes in geopolitical status could occur without fundamentally upsetting the system and creating conflict. And as you have mentioned before, it will work only through 4 interlocking components, but I would like to specifically pay attention to the third component, and define non-aligned status for in-between states, the third way. And by this third way, you mean that status would ensure respect for states' non-alignment and preclude future major power conflicts regarding its status and returning for its agreement to seek changes in alignment only in consultation with the permanent participants of the RSC, basically with Russia, US, and EU. So my question is, why all of the mentioned above statements go in direct conflict with the following documents? Such as Article 2 of the UN Charter, which is organization is based on sovereign equality of all member states, as well as the Declaration on Principles of International Law, which is, I quote from preamble, the duty not to intervene in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of any members, as well as the principle of sovereign equality of all states. So that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yulia, do you want to tackle that one?
Why don't we take a couple?
Yeah. All right, let's take one from the gentleman there in the left. Yes, you, sir.
You'll be surprised, I'm also from Ukraine. I'm actually one of those 12 who are representing Ukraine here. I'm from Ukrainian embassy. Actually, we're 50, but numbers speak for themselves. Anyway, thank you for your explicit work. And I was just trying to address one issue here. As you proposed in the mentioned document, well, basically everything is around Russia being present in the RSC, the Regional Security Consultations. So, and I quote, it is said in your document that this is a political commitment, not a legal one. I remember one political commitment that was a Budapest Memorandum, where Russia also was part of the security guarantee. And the only country that actually broke that political commitment by basically waging a war in my country. And, well, I strongly support my young colleague here. By the way, thank you for the question, that was explicit. I don't really know that whether that will be a good idea to trust Russia. I'm just really curious about the instruments that will make the so-called in-between states trust Russia again, because there are so many examples in history where that actually failed. And I'm not so sure about the in-between states, but I'm against calling my country and the countries that are in the region post-Soviet, because we're not calling America the former England colony, which is also right historically, but it's probably not accurate in the situation nowadays. So I would rather you refer to our countries, the in-between states, as Eastern European. Thank you.
Point noted. Let's take one more question, and then we'll have our panel respond. How about the lady in the back there next to the camera?
Hello, my name is Mariam Graheldi. I work for Voice of America, Georgian service. I would like to ask you, how do you see Georgian-Russian economic relations when every time something happens in Georgia, Russia uses economic sanctions? And also in terms of conflict management, what could you say? Like, what could Georgia do about conflict management with Abkhazia and Skhin Valley regions? And I'm sure you know that borderization is an ongoing process and Russian border is moving forward in Georgia. Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to go ahead and let the panel respond to these. The first one was the third way, is that consistent with the rights of states under prevailing international law to orient themselves the way they seem fit? Anybody want to take that one? Or feel free to respond to any of them.
Well, maybe we should go in reverse order. I don't know if Vasily, you want to go first this time? If you don't,
sure?
I can.
Are you sure? Okay, I sometimes feel sorry for Sam because, as he said at the beginning, we had 3 groups. Each group worked in its own atmosphere and logic, and we learned about what other groups prepared only after the text was read. And you can imagine what and Sam was my counterpart, whom I had to present what I thought about work of other groups. I will not disclose everything, but I feel sorry for him to listen everything what I thought about it. I'm pretty sure that in Ukraine it will not be accepted by anyone. And what you said, it just goes without saying that to imagine that someone in Ukraine would accept that there are two levels of states, one in regional permanent consultations and as permanent participants, and others not, is just non-starter. And it's not about actually only Ukraine, UK. Where is UK in this system? UK used to be in EU, so you could imagine UK as a member of EU would be there. But now UK is out. So UK, together with Ukraine, is in between states, UK between US and EU. So there's plenty of questions about this idea of having big three, US, Russia, and EU discussing on permanent basis regional security issues, and others who may be heard in case if their interests are on the agenda. And again, the biggest point is not really a new format. They meet and discuss every time. Recently in Berlin, issue of Libya, they had these consultations. It was what they describe. It was a consultation of interested parties about situation in Libya. It's that. Nothing limits countries if they want to meet and discuss. The point, which I think again, but they will defend it. I think it will be more adequate if Sam and Julia would explain what they mean under this big three concept. Idea is here that actually review of European security architecture, despite its obvious failure of defending Ukraine, failure of Budapest Memorandum, and failure of OSCE to protect Ukraine against Russian invasion, is a statement of inability of current European security architecture to fulfill its basic function to protect countries against foreign invasion. Moreover, we are talking about the country which voluntarily denounced nuclear weapon and received in response guarantees from P5 permanent members of Security Council. So is it correct that we have a basic acknowledgement of inability of existing institutions to fulfill their functions and nothing has been done? Is it good or not? And we all agree it's not. What to do with this, it's another question, whether we need to establish this format or that format, or maybe it's OSCE, which must collect and discuss what to do. Maybe we should start talking about reform of United Nations. Actually, it's UN, which was created to protect countries from foreign invasion, and UN failed to do it in case of Ukraine. So maybe we should start from an issue of veto right for some countries by which misuse this veto right and make impossible for United Nations to defend countries which become victim of foreign invasion. Maybe this is an issue we have to discuss, but it's one of many ideas. We can for hours talk about it. And what I welcome is readiness of my colleagues to put the issue on the table and to acknowledge we must finally start discussing what to do in order to protect countries against their bigger and better armed neighbors, especially those neighbors which are in Security Council with their veto rights and nuclear weapons, if existing institutions do not work. I think it's a good attempt, and let's discuss what should we do.
Okay, there was a question on Georgian-Russian trade disruptions. Well, I think what the economic proposal boils down to, this proposal of multi-directional trade relations, is economic diversification. So I think Georgia is an excellent example showing that it exports goods such as wine, for example, which are much more competitive on the Russian/Eurasian Economic Union market simply because they're well known there and very loved, like Kinzmarauli wines, Borjomi water, and which I don't often see in shops in the European Union. So, of course, trade disruptions happen, but what we have seen gradually since 2012, that Georgia, after bans and trade disruptions, regained this exporting facility to Russia, which is, I think, purely from economic terms, good and beneficial. So the more linkages are forged in terms of those multi-directional trade relations, the more stable countries potentially are, especially if disruptions like this happen. So you see it's a bit more complicated than just kind of putting the blame, okay, this partner keeps on disrupting trade, so we better don't trade with him. Our proposal boils down to the fact that it's still better to kind of explore as many options as you have. So this would be my answer to that one.
How do you deal with violations, or how do you deal with, say, a country deciding that it wants to impose sanctions after one of these? Sorry. So under this scenario, how do you deal with violations of these agreements. So say that, you know, there is a trade agreement and one country decides that it wants to, say, impose sanctions in violation of that agreement because of one reason or another.
I think this would be an issue for being addressed to the trilateral consultations. We were generally discussing also in other groups that big players cannot be forced to play by the rules, and this is the ultimate limitation of our proposal. But voluntary trilateral consultations can help alleviate some of the problems, that can help bring a violator back to the negotiating table and can help us find a compromise. So that would be one option.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Oh, sorry, my team wants to respond further. Excuse me.
Okay, so on the question, how can Ukraine trust Russia again, generally? So, and just one little disclaimer that here I don't represent neither Russia officially nor MGIMA, that's just my own perspective. So now I will try to give my own vision of how this question can be answered. So it goes without saying that if I were to represent Russia officially, I would have to disagree with a lot of things that Vasil said, but I will not do it now. So Ukraine doesn't trust Russia, the US doesn't trust Russia, but Russia also does not trust the West and especially the United States. Why? We have two reasons. One is Georgia 2003, the second is Ukraine 2014. I mean, Shevardnadze was quite a pro-Western leader, but still he was toppled. So the conclusion taken by the Russian leadership is that, okay, even if you are a pro-Western government, it doesn't mean anything. You still can be toppled, and the West will support the opposition. The second conclusion, Yanukovych made a deal with the opposition in February 2014, and the West pledged to guarantee this deal. So I'm now talking about the perception of Russian officials, how they view the situation. And from their perspective, even if you make a deal with the West, there are no guarantees that the West will, in a way, support these deals later on. And that's why Russia believes that, okay, the conclusion is, how can you trust the West, especially if we bear in mind the so-called democratic peace theory that democracies do not fight each other, but they can fight non-democracies, like in Iraq in 2003, for example, and Russia is seen by the West as a non-democracy. No matter that we believe that we are a democratic state, if the West believes that Russia is not a democracy, then Russia can be attacked at any time. And again, it means that Russian leadership doesn't feel safe, and that's why they're taking all the measures. Are there alternative ways how to react to all those situations? Of course, every situation has different solutions, but I'm trying to explain you the official logic, and generally this leads us to the answer to your question. Actually, we're now in a situation of balance of threats. Like in between countries, they don't want to be the battleground for the major powers who have disputes about regional governance or global governance. Russia is afraid of interference in domestic affairs, that the West supports the Russian opposition, and the West, the US, is also afraid of the interference in its domestic affairs, like the elections and so on. So everyone is afraid, like both Russia and the West are afraid of the interference in the domestic affairs of each other. And that's why, of course, unfortunately, the nature of the international relations is that legally binding agreements are possible only if major powers commit to them voluntarily. No one can make them really abide by their own agreements. So that's why it's not so important to have legally binding agreements if the political agreements are there. So that's probably the weak point. I mean that we understand that that's a situation. Do you have any better alternative? The point of the current discussion is that if you're critical, be constructive, so please suggest a better alternative. So this group spent a lot of time, more than a year, on discussing that. We know most of the counter arguments that you can provide. If you can provide a better solution, complex solution, now no party is happy with the result. I would say, like, neither the US nor Ukraine nor Russia, like, we see the result and say, okay, every country would see a lot of negative points for itself. And the point is that, okay, let's do at least something, let's discuss. I see your point, I understand your point, but I cannot provide you a solution if all the politicians in the world cannot do that. Do you expect me to give you the answer?
I'm not expecting you to give me any answers. I'm just, the question was, so we signed sort of a agreement with Russia in it that was political. It was already done, and now Russia broke it. And the question was, what are the instruments if Russia decides to break it again? And
so we do address explicitly the Budapest Memorandum and the history of that document and precisely the problem that you identify. And there are attempts to find lessons, to extract lessons from that negative experience. And the proposal includes a number of things that differentiate it from Budapest. First of all, the form. The intention is to have it as a UN Security Council resolution as opposed to a set of political commitments. To have explicit terms. In other words, the bargain is explicit about non-alignment in return for multilateral security guarantees, and to have an exit clause. In other words, if one party is violating it, the other party is explicitly, and the other parties are explicitly granted the given the right to leave. So, but broadly speaking, all of that will not, or none of that will compel Russia, the U.S., to, any major power to dramatically change their policies if they believe that continuing to abide by an agreement is not in their interest. International affairs, the history of international politics is riddled with cases when great powers decide one day that an agreement is no longer in their interest and they cease to abide by it. The purpose of the proposal in that part of it is to create the circumstances under which the relative countries believe it to be in their interest to comply with the agreement. So you don't need, there is no policeman that will arrest Russia if it violates an agreement. That's the nature of international politics. But it's about creating circumstances under which there will not be incentives to violate agreements, as opposed to enforcement by some coercive mechanism, which, at least in that group, they could not identify, and I, on that score at least, tend to agree. I would also just add, in terms of sovereign equality, voluntary commitments do not diminish sovereign equality. So commitments undertaken voluntarily in no way abridge any other rights of states under international law, particularly in the context of informal consultations.
Well, I'm afraid our time has elapsed. Sorry to those who did not get to ask questions, but
5 minutes or so?
all right. I will relent and I will allow 2 more questions. The gentleman over here in the middle. And this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Finally, I've been able to ask a question. I'm Azad from Embassy of Azerbaijan. My question is with regard to points or with regard to the conflict. So that has been mentioned in the report, and thank you. I would like to thank you for mentioning this conflict as a part of security architecture, addressing security architecture. But my concern is with regard to the focusing only on conflict mitigation or conflict management points and so-called pain reduction measures without addressing the core reasons of the conflict. So the thing is, especially with regard to, as Vasily mentioned about people first approach. So in our case, for example, if we don't take into account the interest of IDPs, so people first is completely overlooked. So in conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we have close to 1 million IDPs and refugees, and unfortunately, there is nothing about that in the report. And there is just a very cursory point with regard to the IDPs, and that's not in the risk reduction or mitigation efforts. That's on general conflict resolution points. So another point is, in our case, this kind of risk reduction measures in a territory, ethnically cleansed territory totally, I don't understand how it will be relevant. So if we're talking about the rights of settlers, that's completely a different thing, because international humanitarian law doesn't recognize such kind of rights for settlers. So they are not defined as protected persons under international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. The gentleman right up front here.
Thank you. My name is Bjorn Fegerberg. I'm the political counselor at the Swedish Embassy here in Washington. I think that one perspective that has been, so the EU keeps cropping up in your, both in your report and also in the comments here. My concern is a little bit that the EU is considered as, being part of the problem here. It is mentioned sort of in passing, together with Russia, and it's the EU, it's Russia that have been contributing in equal measure to the problems that we see. And a case in point is where you write, Samuel, in your introduction, that the major powers, the European Union, the United States, and Russia, have pursued policies toward the region that have contributed to today's disorder and instability. And I could go on forever about how I don't feel that is a fair description of what the EU has been doing. But I would ask you to lay out what are the ways in which the European Union has actually contributed to instability and disorder, because someone who's been working on the EU's Eastern policy for taken together with my service in the Swedish Foreign Ministry for more than a decade, I don't really recognize that description of the EU as an actor here. And secondly, you ask a rhetorical question. So
I'm going to have to limit it to the one question given the time. Sorry, sir.
Oh, right. Thanks. But please tell me, why is sticking to the existing order worse than changing the order, as you suggest?
Thanks. EU, are we treating them fairly in this report? Number one. Number two is, what about pain reduction measures? Please.
In my point, it's very easy to answer. There are not only this, but many other issues which we are not able to cover because of amount of pages. But issue of IDPs was discussed, and I think we have even IDPs in one of measures we listed. But certainly, issue which you mentioned is important and demands additional attention.
Of the two questions that were asked in the final remarks there, I would pick the second, given that we don't have time to answer both. Because I think it is a fundamental one. If you believe that everything is great as far as concerns the security architecture, the state of economic integration in the region, and the regional conflicts, then this is not the report for you. I think that the people involved in this project, though, started from a different premise, that actually the situation is pretty bad and getting worse. That there are not only lost opportunities, but lost lives, and that the current dynamic we are on seems likely only to continue to get worse. So at the very least, contemplating alternatives to the status quo is what responsible policy analysts should be doing. That's our job, as opposed to, I think, trying to prevent discussion of alternatives to the status quo. You're, of course, free to disagree, and we welcome suggestions about your own ideas about alternatives. But I think the premise we started from was a different one, that the situation is actually pretty bad and that the costs of doing nothing are going to accumulate over time.
Well, Well, that wraps up this event. I want to thank the panelists for a very informative and lively discussion. I want to thank all of you for attending, and please join me in a well-deserved round of applause.